if you had to explain what actually is metacognition to someone, I know it's that question because it's one of those that like we can talk about retrieval and growth mindset and resilience, and everyone kind of knows immediately what the name is about. But metacognition is one of those things that I think it's not very intuitive as to what the actual areas it covers are. Where do you begin? How would you define it, I guess?
I always love to, I mean, people have always told me it's thinking about thinking. And I think that that's actually a real misconception. It really simplifies what metacognition is. And I really like actually Alex Quigley's definition in the EES report on metacognition and self-regulated learning, where he talks about metacognition being the ability to monitor, direct, and review learning. And I think that actually, for me, that's the best definition I found in all kind of little bits of research I've done around metacognition. So I think that's quite easy then to try and implement or try, I use that word, implement, ability to be able to monitor students' learning, direct their learning, and then helping them to review that learning. I think that's quite quantifiable in some sense. And I think teachers, we love things that we can try and implement in the classroom straight away. And I feel like that's what that particular definition allows us to maybe do.
Yeah. So for what it's worth, I share your sentiments of like, I actually now hate thinking about thinking, because I think, although it's probably technically correct in terms of what the translation of the word is, if you ask a student to think about their thinking, or if you say to teachers, we need to get our students thinking about their thinking, I don't know what I'd expect them to do come next Thursday. Whereas if you go direct, how do we get students to direct their learning? How do we get them to review their learning, or those sort of areas, or monitor their learning? It becomes more tangible, I think, for me, and therefore less ambiguous. It's kind of how I see it.
That misconception around thinking about thinking, I mean, you're right, how do we ever get to explain that to students? And I think what I love about particularly the EF is it's not just about what the teacher does, it's really about what the students doing about their own learning. I think that's why I really like that definition.
And so on that note, just because you mentioned it's about getting the students to really kind of do this stuff, do you guys use that word with the students? Like if you said metacognition to your students, do they know what it means? Or do you use other words to describe the same thing? So I've seen schools do it either way. I'm just curious to see kind of what you guys do.
You know, to start off with, we use the word self-regulation because that's a word that we use as a school anyway. It's part of our school kind of culture to talk about self-regulation with students. But actually metacognition is something we've slowly started to introduce, and we've started to do that through form time. So when I was SLT Link for Year 11 last year, for example, we created a whole full-time program about metacognition, teaching students about the working memory, you know, the cognitive load theory, actually teaching them so they were empowered essentially with the knowledge that they needed, so that when we taught them strategies like retrieval practice, spaced learning, interleaving, they understood how it linked with cognitive kind of science that we just taught them. So with the older students, we definitely do use metacognition. With the younger students, we tend to use self-regulation because I think that it's easier to understand maybe.
Yeah, and probably gets more buy-in if it's easier to understand, I assume.
Exactly. What we don't want to do is we don't want to alienate students from their own about thinking. We don't want to make it seem jargony. We just want them to be able to use those strategies, understand it, and then use it independently, because that's essentially what we're trying to do. We're trying to create independent learners who are then able to leave our school and be able to utilize a lot of these strategies. And we know that with metacognition, as learners, as adults, you know, as teachers, for example, we might be able to do these things naturally, and implicitly, because we've never. Whereas what we need to do is teach our students those skills for them to then be able to use it eventually, and then be able to use it independently when they're outside, you know, in the wider world.
Yeah, and it's interesting that, isn't it? Because I think I see it a lot in the research, especially, is frustratingly the most popular learning strategies tend to be the least effective, probably because they're the easiest in terms of mental effort. And so it's not just enough, I guess, for us to do it in our lessons. It's how do we get students to eventually do this independently themselves? And I guess one question I wanted to ask was, if we're talking about metacognition and these different components, some people say to me, they can see how that would work well for older students, because it sounds like it requires a fair amount of nuance and understanding. And yet, from what I've read of the research, you know, we can help develop these metacognitive abilities from quite a young age. I know a lot of primary schools, say in the UK, are interested in metacognition, just as the secondary and older schools are. What's your thoughts on that in terms of how do we start the age and how we start developing metacognitive skills?
Yeah, I think first it's an important just scientific question about how young can a student take advantage of these capabilities. And there's quite a bit of research going on with younger children and the degree to which they can monitor their progress. And they can control their progress. And it turns out there's some limitations when we're younger, but they also have some capabilities that can be built upon. Right? So we know even young students understand what it means to fail a test, right? That they don't understand, that they need to do something more. So there's some metacognitive capabilities that are available to even young students that teachers can capitalize on. Now, that said, at least in the United States, we do not focus that much on metacognition with younger children to their, I think, great detriment, because one of the core components of this, especially when we're younger, is knowledge about how cognition works. And that is what strategies I can use to build on my cognition. And I really wish a great more emphasis in the United States were put on training students to use these strategies so they can see the benefits and start naturally embracing them and using them in their own studies. Whereas typically in the United States, we just train content.
Right. Which is interesting, because I guess, in the UK, as an example, we're seeing a lot more. I feel like we're further ahead in that respect of there's lots of discussions going on at the moment around how do we use cognitive science and metacognition, and how do we develop those sort of aspects, even from a young age?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if the ultimate goal, you start as a young age, but eventually you'll graduate from college or your terminal degree, whatever that is. And most of the relevant learning is ahead of you in life.
Right.
And those folks who can effectively learn, efficiently learn, are probably going to enjoy it more and be more successful in all their pursuits, whether it be a hobby like playing a guitar or what have you, or in their profession where they might need to learn a lot of new content. That, of course, how could a school system predict everything an individual would need to know? So training these skills is really giving students wings to regulate their own learning after they leave.